Hello and welcome back. Today we examine the economic, political, and social foundations of the 20th century. We will consider the development of industrialized society, the establishment of capitalist economics, and the impact that these had on the everyday life of early 20th century people across the globe. Understanding this significant economic and social shift requires looking back to the 19th century, when Europe began a period of radical economic transformation, shifting from agriculture to modern industry. The Industrial Revolution, as it came to be known, was fomented by new technologies and the development of a new technique of production, the factory system. The new modes of production brought great wealth and increasing political influence to the owners of the new factories. They were part of a rising social class called the bourgeoisie, or middle class. But all was not rosy during the Industrial Revolution. Factory workers were forced to endure harsh working conditions and long hours. Many would actually die of disease and malnutrition. So while industrialization gave factory owners cause to celebrate, it forced the factory workers to wonder what advancements one actually found in their harsh new lives in the factory towns of the 19th century. When Europe began a period of radical economic transformation, shifting from agriculture to modern industry. The Industrial Revolution, as it came to be known, was fomented by new technologies and the development of a new technique of production, the factory system. The new modes of production brought great wealth and increasing political influence to the owners of the new factories. They were part of a rising social class called the bourgeoisie, or middle class. But all was not rosy during the Industrial Revolution. Factory workers were forced to endure harsh working conditions and long hours. Many would actually die of disease and malnutrition. So while industrialization gave factory owners cause to celebrate, it forced the factory workers to wonder what advancements one actually found in their harsh new lives in the factory towns of the 19th century. So what were the advantages of the new factories? I've narrowed these down to four main items. First, factories concentrated all materials and labor under one roof. This cut down on transportation costs and increased efficiency. The use of machines also facilitated the standardization of the product, meaning that clothes produced by the same machines in the same factory were consistently the same size and quality. Also, the use of machines in factories eliminated the need for specialized workers, those that were able to cut patterns and sew seams and buttons. The machines were much simpler to operate, only requiring the memorization of 3 or 4 actions. This cut down on training time and expanded the labor market to include any able-bodied person. Lastly, all of these factors facilitated quality control, ensuring that all products produced in the factory met the expectations of management and, by extension, the consumer. The technological advancements of the time were celebrated with modern monuments built out of iron, the new material that made factories possible. Here you see an example of such celebration, the Crystal Palace in London, England. It was built in 1851 completely out of iron and glass. The Industrial Revolution was also celebrated by its biggest beneficiaries, the factory owners. This emerging social class, which came to be referred to as the bourgeoisie, or middle class, became the new power players in 19th century economics and, by extension, politics. Many of them had started out as shopkeepers or businessmen, and after investing their savings into building a factory, had reaped the benefits of the rapid expansion of industrial markets. They became quite rich and established themselves as the alternative to royalty at the top of the social and economic ladder. This shift in both affluence and influence of the bourgeoisie was made evident in middle-class fashion. Wide, cumbersome dresses became all the rage among bourgeois women. The difficulty of putting these monstrosities on and walking around in them made it clear that those who wore them were well off. What poor woman could afford such luxury? What poor woman had 2 hours in the morning and 1 hour in the evening to put it on and take it off? Or better yet, what poor woman had a house big enough to fit the dress? On the left you see a cartoon of the time ridiculing the size of these dresses. The 2 poor boys on the right are asking themselves how the dress is going to fit into the small carriage. On the right you have an actual photograph of a woman having the top layer of her dress lowered onto her by 2 assistants. Notice the poles they are using to lower the dress. But not all were celebrations in early industrial society. The factory workers suffered greatly in the early 1800s. They were subjected to dehumanizing working conditions. They were forced to live in crowded and overpriced housing. They were exposed to extremely polluted water and air, which caused rampant outbreaks of life-threatening diseases such as tuberculosis and cholera. Because factories were built with little concern for worker safety, it was common for workers to get their arms and legs caught in machines, forcing the amputation of the extremity. Here you see a typical worker dwelling in 1830s England. Each door you see led into a separate apartment. Each apartment had only 2 floors, the bottom for the kitchen and the top for the bedroom, shared usually by a family of between 6 and 12 people. There was no running water or bathrooms. In some cases, housing shortages forced 2 or even 3 families to live in each apartment. Worker families rarely had enough money or space to put in enough beds for everyone, so it was not unheard of for families to sleep in shifts. And so industrialization gave rise to 2 drastically different lifestyles. While the bourgeoisie enjoyed all the comforts their newfound riches could afford, workers suffered dreadful and desperate situations. In the image here you see children in both social scenarios. On the right are bourgeois children, dressed in nice clothing, participating in a social function with their parents' friends. On the left you see dirty orphan children, dressed in rags and eating porridge out of cups. Orphan children grew greatly in number in early 19th century England, their parents having either died at the factories or abandoned them after realizing that they could not afford to support them. Lastly, the lack of running water and proper hygiene in factory cities increased the incidence of diseases. Diseases caused by waterborne bacteria were especially prevalent. The most devastating was cholera, which consumed the body within 3 to 5 days of exposure and could easily wipe out over half of a city's population within a couple of weeks. There were worldwide cholera outbreaks in 1831, 1848, 1852, and 1866. Worker neighborhoods were especially prone to this disease since the water they drank came from the same rivers into which toilets were drained and factories pumped refuse. In 1830, the average lifespan in England was 35 years of age. One could expect to live on average 35 years. This is less than half of the current life expectancy for someone living in the United States. Yet, as low as these numbers were, they were for all of England. In industrial cities such as Manchester, one of the first cities to grow around factories, the average lifespan was 17 years of age. On average, you could expect to be dead before you even turned 18. The success story of the bourgeoisie, the new power players of industrial society, contrasted with the harsh working and living conditions of factory workers. This apparent contradiction gave rise to alternate explanations of the industrial phenomenon. While some of these exalted the virtues of industrialism, others decried its deficiencies and offered alternatives. We will now concentrate on the ideas of 2 major proponents of these interpretations, Adam Smith and Karl Marx. You have images of them here. They're facing off, as you can see. Rather serious fellows. In any case, Adam Smith can be considered the father of economic liberalism, or as it is more typically referred to, capitalism. And Karl Marx was the founder and most visible proponent of communist theory, a version of socialism. We start with Adam Smith and his explanation of the industrial phenomenon. Smith published a book entitled An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations in 1776, the same year as the United States declared itself independent from England. The arguments developed in the book became the basis of modern capitalist theory. According to Adam Smith, the multiple and varied jobs found in an industrial setting necessitated a clear division of labor, allowing individuals to specialize in specific jobs that they were good doing. This, he argued, would produce the most wealth. It justified the differentiation between managers and workers and justified a differentiated pay scale. In other words, factory owners and factory managers could earn more money because they were better at doing their job, the job of controlling the larger factory. This was more complicated, Smith would argue, than working at an actual factory machine. Motivation to produce wealth was also a critical point for Adam Smith. He considered that human beings are by nature self-interested, that they look out for their interests first. and that this was an elemental factor in determining wealth. The harder one works, the more they will earn. The higher one will climb. Smith did differentiate, however, between self-interest and selfishness. The objective of the self-interest is to motivate one to achieve without abusing other individuals' rights, which would be considered by Smith selfishness. Adam Smith also denounced government involvement in economic issues. As you might remember from our lecture on the American Revolution, mercantilism dominated European economic dealings. This meant that colonies could only trade with the mother country. Smith considered mercantilism was counterproductive and that it created a false level of values for traded goods established by governments. Instead, he suggested that prices should depend on the supply and the demand for the good. If supply diminished and demand went up, prices would increase. If, on the other hand, supply increased and demand went down, prices would go down as vendors tried to get rid of the extra goods they had. Competition also played a critical role. The self-interest to make money would lead manufacturers and vendors to compete against each other to sell cheaper, thereby keeping the prices low, which also benefited the consumer. Smith called this the invisible hand of economics. He argued that it was a natural process and therefore required no government intervention. In fact, government should, for the good of human development, detach themselves from trade, giving way to what Smith called laissez-faire economics, or free trade. With these arguments, Adam Smith established the fundamentals of capitalist economics. To this day, Smith's conception of supply and demand, competition, and free trade dominate international capitalist economics. The key ideas of economic liberalism, even today, are one, the equality of opportunity, meaning that everybody has at least the same chance to become rich. It also, in a sense, though, justifies poverty as a lack of self-interest. Secondly, individualism. This is the belief that the individual is the foundation of society. From the accomplishment of individuals would come the greatness of a nation. So one's responsibility to society, we could say, is to make individual gains. This will then lead to a larger social gain. Also, legal equality. Even though there are economic differences within society, all must be equal before the law. And lastly, poverty and other deficiencies are dealt with through self-help and charity. Either you learn to pick yourself up by learning self-help techniques. Motivational speakers try to get you to do this. Or those that have struck it rich should help you out with charity. Adam Smith was convinced that this last point would wipe out poverty and ensure that society kept growing and improving. However, more than 200 years after the publication of The Wealth of Nations, we can say that Adam Smith at this level was not completely right. Poverty continues to be a problem, a severe problem, in all capitalist countries. The growing social and economic inequality of capitalist society came to be known as the social question. While the factory owners, the bourgeoisie, were reaping the benefits of industrial development, their workers saw little improvement in their precarious situation. Few factory owners took an interest in improving the poor working and living conditions of their factory hands. The social question, or the question of what to do to improve the lives of industrial workers, soon gave rise to harsh criticism for capitalist economics. One of the first critics of capitalism was Friedrich Engels, a factory owner himself. In his book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, he described the discouraging conditions in Manchester factories. Criticism also appeared in literature. The famous novelist Charles Dickens described the horrifying results of uncontrolled industrial development in his aptly entitled books Hard Times and Oliver Twist, which described with painful detail the experiences of orphans in England, the most innocent victims of the Industrial Revolution. The growing concern with answering the social question gave rise to new socialist ideologies that offered a different approach. First, rather than equality of opportunity, socialists would argue in favor of equality of outcome. to ensure that all members of society were properly fed, clothed, and housed. Secondly, the foundation of society should not be the individual, but rather the social collective. In other words, the individual had to think of the good of society over personal achievement. Social and economic equality was critical to this formulation as well, because economic inequality had led to the injustices of capitalism. Lastly, ensuring equality required state intervention. This is at least what socialists argued. In their minds, state intervention would avoid individual selfishness. The first socialists we can group into the category of utopian socialists. They proposed idyllic alternatives to the harsh realities of industrialism. As passionate as some of the arguments utopian socialists made, these arguments were rarely accompanied by well thought out and structured alternatives to capitalism. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels changed that in 1848 with the writing of their Communist Manifesto. Marx revolutionized socialism by applying scientific rationalism to the study and understanding of social inequality. In Marx's mind, economic trends were much more determinant than important historic figures. From this, he concluded that class struggles, that is, the struggle between different economic groups, had dominated history. In the period of industrialization, the most noticeable class struggle was that between the factory owners and the factory workers, between what he called the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. For Marx, power in the industrial era resided in the control of what he called the modes of production. The bourgeoisie had the capital, or money, to invest in building factories and buying machinery. However, the workers also owned something, their labor. In other words, without their labor, without their work, the factories would remain empty and nothing would be produced. As such, Marx asked why it was that the profits of industrial production were not shared between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. This, for him, was the fundamental injustice of modern industrial society. The reason for this, Marx argued, was that capitalism corrupts morality. The self-interest Adam Smith talked about was nothing more than selfishness. All factory owners wanted was more and more money. In Marx's mind, it was indeed all about the Benjamins. Organized religion contributed to the inequality by convincing people to accept the harsh realities of industrial life, promising them a better future in heaven. Marx, who was an avowed atheist, considered religious teachings the opiate of the masses, keeping people quiet and accepting in the face of social oppression, in the same way that they would if they had taken opium. For Marx, the only solution to these injustices was a radical transformation of society that could only come about as a result of a revolution, a communist revolution. The proletariat were to rise up, defeat the numerically inferior bourgeoisie, and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat that would institute social equality and teach the bourgeoisie to become good, socialist proletarians. Socialist ideas began to take hold in industrial cities throughout Europe. Under the slogan of "Workers of the World Unite," worker unions were founded to give strength to workers' interests. 1864 saw the foundation of the International Workingmen's Association, better known as the Internationale. Worker activism led to confrontations with factory owners and authorities. Workers' demands for shorter working hours and better pay were answered typically with factory lockouts, arrests, and jail time. Violence soon came to dominate these confrontations. In 1871, worker protests in Paris led to a popular revolt that gained control of most of the city and established a commune of workers. The authorities finally defeated the insurgents, but only after the army was called in to reestablish the government's authority in the city. Nevertheless, the Paris Commune would inspire similar popular revolts throughout Europe in the decades that followed. As we will see in the coming weeks, support for socialism kept growing in the early 20th century, dividing the political spectrum between capitalist and socialist interests. The division only grew after a socialist revolution successfully took power in Russia in 1917. The major economic, political, and military struggles of the 20th century would be dominated by the conflict between these two ideologies. And that's it for now. I will talk to you next week.